is hard to believe. It is difficult to believe because we see the opposite all the time. But it's true. It is a fact. The world's life expectancy keeps going up, along with literacy, the emancipation of women, universal education everywhere, and access to healthcare services. All of those things contribute to a more peaceful world. So can we do the same for the eradication of state-sponsored warfare? Yes, we can. It is possible. We have done it on many occasions now. The peace movement around the world has not only stopped wars that are ongoing. The war I was in, Vietnam, is a good example of that. It was stopped by a peace movement. But there are many other examples of wars that have been averted by active peace movements and by negotiation and by peacekeeping forces and many of the other things that exist in the world to try to stop the scourge of war continuing to afflict humanity. I think I'll stop there. I just wanted to give kind of a general summary of some of the things I've been thinking about and speaking about now for several years around the issue of war and peace. Because this is a Q&A session, which we didn't have time for there at the peace gathering, I want to just open the floor to questions, comments, your thoughts and ideas, and let's share, some of what we know and some of what we'd like to know about peace. I used to be a college professor many lifetimes ago. And so generally, when I call for discussion, as I did in many, many classrooms, I've learned to wait until someone has the boldness and the temerity to actually speak. So now I'll be waiting. Brent has his hand up.
Yes. David, from your last talk at the peace conference, you said that your father was an alcoholic and he loved war. My father was an alcoholic, and I'm similar, nowhere as severe as what you had to put up with it, but it wasn't the best situation. Anyway, I was wondering if you pray for your father.
Wow, what a question. Every day. Every day. There are wonderful Baha'i prayers for the intercession of children on behalf of their parents. My mother and father have both passed on to the next world, and my wife and I have a spiritual practice. We sit in our library and say prayers every morning around dawn. And we've done that for many, many years. And each one of those morning sessions includes, from one or the other of us, prayers for our parents. I used to feel great animosity toward my father when I was young, because he was a brutal, violent man, and I was the oldest of 5 children, and he took a lot of that anger out on me. But I now see, after I went to war and saw what he dealt with as a young man. He joined the United States Marines when he was 18 years old in 1940. And of course, World War II had not yet begun. But he went to war, fought World War II in the Pacific for 5 years on places like Tarawa and Iwo Jima. And he was forever changed by that. How do I know? Well, you know, his brothers and sisters, my aunts and uncles, told me what he was like as a boy. Fun-loving, carefree, yeah, a terrific athlete. He was a skier, like most Norwegians, and he was completely changed by war. He never talked about it, but my uncle, his younger brother, showed me at one point a newspaper clipping from his local newspaper in North Dakota, and it recounted a story. My father was nominated for the Medal of Honor in World War II, and it recounted the story of why that happened. On one of the island invasions in the Pacific Campaign, he fought in pitched combat with his unit for about 48 hours. If you can imagine that, combat for 2 days straight. And when it was over, he was unconscious and wounded in a foxhole. And around the foxhole, there were 36 dead Japanese soldiers that he had personally killed. Many of them after he ran out of ammunition in hand-to-hand combat. I don't know if it's, you know, if it's even possible for anyone to imagine what that does to the human mind and the human soul. But in my father, it created, and of course, this term wasn't invented then, it created enormous post-traumatic stress disorder. And the only way he knew how to anesthetize that and deal with it was by drinking. That was the accepted way then. You weren't supposed to talk about your war experiences. You couldn't share them because people couldn't really understand them or empathize. And so what did you do? Well, you got some anesthesia every night. And that's what led to his alcoholic decline. So now that I think about him, I realize that it wasn't my father who perpetrated that violence on his children. It was the war itself. And that's what war does. It echoes down through generations. I'll stop there. Thank you for that question.
Well, David, you've done better than me. There's moments when I curse my father, and there's moments when I pray for him. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. I think all of us are in that boat, Brant. I really do. Everybody who grows up with a combat veteran as a parent probably has to deal with some of these same issues. Now there's a great deal of research. I was reading yesterday in the New York Times about a whole slew of new research on the impact of trauma, severe trauma, on your genes. And of course, we now know it's been proven that trauma in a young life can permanently alter your genetic makeup, and that makeup is then passed to your children. There was a really fascinating study in this article that I read yesterday about the transmission of traumatic disorders genetically. A woman did a study that involved two groups. One were Jewish women who had lived through World War II, but had not been persecuted during that period. And the other group was Jewish women who were survivors of the Holocaust, who had been in death camps, etc. And what they did was study their children and grandchildren. And the children and grandchildren of the Holocaust victims, the survivors of the Holocaust, had enormously high levels of stress hormones and fear in their genetic makeup. They described themselves as being extremely fearful. Where did that come from? probably their mothers and grandmothers. Pretty profound. So we're just learning this. We're starting to figure out scientifically how severely the trauma of war affects not just soldiers, but everyone in the entire society. Gretchen, you're muted.
Oh,
Oh,
there. Oh, Gretchen's speaking.
what?
There's a lot of dialogue today in the First Nations communities about intergenerational trauma.
Yes.
And it's really good to hear the scientific source of that instead of just firsthand accounts through friends and survivors of the residential schools.
Yeah. Exactly.
Thanks, David.
You're welcome. I really highly recommend some of the books on the residential schools. Really profound insights into the kind of intergenerational trauma that you're talking about.
David, I think John wants to ask you a question. But John, this subject, I think there's studies about this in the past on other subjects. For example, I know years ago I heard about a study that children of parents who have fetal alcohol syndrome passes for children, even though they haven't had anything to drink, and that
Wow.
it can go generation after generation. So I think they kind of started making this connection with alcoholism. So it's not surprising that it shows up in so many other areas.
Yeah.
Anyhow.
Yeah, David, I just wanted to ask you if you had experienced any form of post-traumatic stress, and if you did, how did you deal with it?
A good question, John. I do have a 70% Veterans Administration disability for post-traumatic stress. So I've been evaluated by the VA, and they use a very long and detailed checklist that they ask about. And I was actually quite surprised when I got that evaluation. But it's certainly justified by the experiences I had in war, what I went through, and how I've tried to deal with that since. Without being too personal, I'll just say that when I first came home from the war, I was still quite young. I was there when I was 19 and 20, and I came home, I re-enrolled in college, and I began to have the typical manifestations of post-traumatic stress. Frequent nightmares that I was back in combat, night sweats that went along with it, an extreme startle response, which I still have. My wife will tell you that I cannot sit with my back to a door if we're in a public place. I still can't do it. We go into a restaurant and I have to sit facing the door. In the Army, they call that situational awareness, and I need to be aware of my surroundings wherever I am. And that's not because I'm in any danger in the nice, peaceful, small town where I live, but because of the extreme trauma hangover from that war, which was, 55 years ago, a lifetime away. I still have the occasional nightmare, but they have dropped in frequency over time as I've devoted myself to a spiritual practice. And because I'm a Baha'i, I meditate daily, I pray daily. Of course, I go to Baha'i meetings, and I am engaged in my Baha'i community, which has given me a great deal of support and love. And I think for me, that is the key to achieving some measure of, I won't say healing or control or anything, but some measure of detente with my own post-traumatic stress. It'll probably never go away. I've resolved that that's just going to be the case because of what I went through, but it can be dealt with, I think, in a spiritual practice, much as alcoholics deal with their alcoholism by going to 12-step meetings. For me, it's the daily practice of reminding myself that that war is not a permanent condition of humanity that really helps. Does that answer your question, John?
Yeah. It's just mind-boggling to me how many people have had their lives so disrupted by that syndrome.
Yeah, it's interesting to me too. I think that one of the things that I'm working on is I'm writing a novel about the war at this point. I kind of like the title War and Peace. What do you think? Is that a good
I think that's been done before.
Oh, it's taken, darn. Anyway, I'm writing this novel, and so I'm kind of back in that space, recalling all these things deliberately instead of accidentally. And it's fascinating to kind of look back on it from an older man's perspective and sort of take inventory of what I've learned since then. One of the things that I've learned that I've really recognized is that in my research for the book, I've seen that many of the social problems of the United States began to not just occur, but be exacerbated as the veterans from war came home. And you think of the issues with mental illness, with drug addiction, with alcoholism, with violent crime. All of those things accompanied the war back home. So in some ways, when we wage war, I think I've come to the conclusion that we not only wage it on others, but we wage it on ourselves, on our own society, because it comes right back and affects all of us in really severe, dire ways. Even if we don't know what the origins of those ways are.
I think with the war going on in Ukraine right now, there's a lot of questions around the aid that's being sent to Ukraine. And I'm just wondering, do you think it's possible to have world peace without the world jointly demilitarizing?
Wow, that's a profound question, Shelley. Let me see if I can answer it. From my perspective, world peace is only possible with world unity. And that means that if we do have a tyrant, if we have a warmonger, someone who invades another country, tries to colonize another country, starts a war without provocation, starts an offensive rather than a defensive war, then it's the world's responsibility to rise up against that tyrant and stop that person. We don't have a mechanism like that today. we've kind of edged close to it a couple of times. You know, it's been called the Coalition of the Willing, or, you know, something like that. We've enlisted, you know, 40, 50 nations. When I was taking physicians and medicines to treat refugees from Kosovo during the NATO bombing in 1999, it was astonishing to see not only the military forces that had been assembled there to stop the Serbian invasion of Kosovo, but the incredible retinue of NGOs, charities, you know, organizations for the good of humanity who assembled there. At one point in the port of Tirana, Albania, which is the capital city of that little country, I counted 50 ships from different countries, and they were all bringing aid. When I took our group, which was 40 physicians from UCLA, there to deal with that issue, I kind of had this expectation. I don't know where I got it, but it was just my own limited thinking, I guess. I had this expectation that we were going to be one of the only groups there. We were one of hundreds of groups, of an outpouring of humanitarian aid to people who were being persecuted and attacked. And it was interesting because the Albanians, I don't know if you remember this, you know, 25 years ago almost now, the Serbs were Christians, still are. The Albanians were Muslims, still are. And so the entire Western world went to Kosovo in defense of the Muslims. It was quite profound, actually, and little covered in the Western press, but very, very noted in the press of the Muslim countries. So that really had an impact on me, because I understood at that moment that it is possible, with concerted, unified effort on behalf of all nations, to actually bring war to a halt. And it doesn't even, I've written about this a great deal, it doesn't even require military action. The world is so interconnected now and so interdependent that we can stop another country on a pure economic basis if we really wished to. We can barricade borders, we can cut off communication and the flow of energy and food and everything else to an aggressor country and stop that country. We have that power. We haven't been able to do it yet, to marshal the will politically on a global scale, but we could. It is possible. And it's what, interestingly enough, it's what the Baha'i writings recommend, that we form a unity of nations and that all of those nations agree, just like the NATO nations have agreed, to rise up and stop aggressors when that aggression occurs. I think that's the model for a unified and peaceful future world, and it's the one that I'm working towards. It makes so much sense to me. Certainly, federations of states, just like the United States or Canada, for example, we are all federated republics. Federations of states have been able to stop intrastate war. You know, Wyoming has not declared war on Idaho lately, nor Saskatchewan and Alberta, although I've heard that recommended lately. The fact is that federations bring peace. That's what we need. We need a world federation.
That means that some country, well, all countries, we're going to have to give up their sovereignty
At least some of it. You're absolutely right. Yes.
to make that work. I
Yes.
just wanted to make a comment, David. You you fought or you didn't fight. You were a medic in the first war where black and white soldiers fought together.
Yeah, that's true.
And I watched a documentary on the Buffalo Soldiers,
Yeah.
and 49,000, I think it was 49,000 black soldiers died in the Civil War.
Hmm.
And they say that if they had not fought, the war might, what am I trying to say? The war might not have succeeded,
Right.
you know?
Right.
And I was just thinking the black soldiers were fighting a war on two fronts. They were being persecuted by their very country they were fighting for. And also the war itself was so hard on them. If you
Yeah.
can just imagine that.
Yeah, it is remarkable. I've read a couple of accounts of Buffalo Soldiers, which are very enlightening. Also, the first American Baha'i, Thornton Chase, was an officer in the Civil War, and he was a captain in charge of a Buffalo Soldier brigade. He was a white officer who took charge of that brigade. This was long before he became a Baha'i. But he said later that his experiences there with African-American soldiers made him absolutely convinced that the unity of humanity racially was necessary to stop war.
Thank you. I didn't realize that Thornton Chase was in the Civil War.
Yeah, he sure was.
I wanted to ask you a different question, David. A couple of days ago, I was reading on one of the Baha'i Facebook page sites. I can't remember which one it was. And there was an interesting dialogue going on about interfaith. And the person who had introduced the thread was talking about he thinks that the interfaith movement is breaking down between liberal faiths and conservative faiths, and maybe we'd be better off without interfaith. I don't agree with him. We've had an interfaith working group in our little town for 7 years or something, and it certainly is conducive to unity. Another Baha'i who posted in that thread said, you know, that their experience working on interfaith committees was that it's one of the things that's moving us towards world peace. And just given your experience, I just wonder if you could speak a little more to that, please.
Oh, sure, Vicki, I'd be happy to. I think it's an important subject, and it was one of the reasons that I came to Grand Forks, because the peace gathering was such a beautifully interfaith experience. One of the things that many social commentators have noticed, more than noticed, talked about a great deal in the Western world, is the decline of religion. The churches have emptied out. The number of people, especially younger people, who classify themselves as having no religion, they call them nuns, by the way, which is hilarious to me because it's not N-U-N, it's N-O-N-E-S. Anyway, the nuns in the United States, at least, are about 40% of people under the age of 30 now. My wife and I are members of the interfaith community here in our small town in Northern California, Grass Valley, in which there are many, many different churches. And surprisingly enough, as you just said, Vicki, there are 2 interfaith groups here. One of them is composed of Quakers, Buddhists, Baha'is, Unitarians, et cetera, et cetera. Most of the, what people might call the more liberal faith groups. The other competing interfaith group is made up of all of the more conservative Christian church attendees and pastors. And never the twain shall meet. You know, the more conservative group wants nothing to do with any of the other faiths in town. And the more progressive group, and I use those words, you know, advisedly, for lack of better ones, wants to be inclusive and welcoming. So those two trends really fascinate me. The fact that there is a growing interfaith movement, and it's definitely growing across the United States and most of the Western world. And the fact of the decline of enrollment in religion. It's really interesting to talk to the ministers and pastors of the churches in our progressive interfaith group here, because many of them are my age. They're in their 70s, 60s or 70s, and they bemoan the fact at every interfaith meeting that it's only the elderly that come to their churches now. It's only people like me with gray hair that show up on Sunday at their churches. And many of them are having real struggles financing their activities, paying the mortgage, you know, doing the things that churches used to so easily do. And I have wondered, and this is just a question that has been in my mind for a while, is this movement away from traditional religion and the rise of interfaith activities, where does that lead? Where will that take us? I can imagine looking down the road a decade or two and seeing a greater unity being forged out of this kind of interfaith movement. I can imagine seeing churches begun to league together, to forget their doctrinal differences, whatever they may be, and instead to all say, well, we believe in a creator. We believe in various messengers and prophets from that creator. And guess what? Their messages are so similar as to be unified. That's, of course, the message that you read in the Baha'i teachings. And increasingly, that's the message I'm seeing from people in interfaith movements. Let's, you know, ignore our relatively minor differences and instead celebrate all the things we have in common. It's really profound, actually. So I can see it moving in a direction that could make a huge difference in the world. And eventually, so many people who are so through with the division in various denominations, the disunity, coming back into a fold that accepts them. That is, I think, a profound possibility. If you're speaking, John, you're muted.
You know, I talk a lot with nuns, and you know, they have, so many of them have, you know, totally high ethical standards. It's just, you know, the religious dogmas put them off, but you know, they've figured out for their lives pretty high ethical standards, as far as I can tell.
Many have. You're absolutely right. I wrote an essay a couple of years ago, and the basic theme of the essay was atheists are often closest to God. Seems a little counterintuitive, but I think it's true. Why? Because atheists have really thought about belief. They've thought about you know, is there something out there that's greater than us? Is there a creative force in the universe? My favorite quote from Einstein, somebody asked him, a journalist once asked him in the 30s if he believed in God. And he got a little twinkle in his eye and he said, well, I don't know, but I do know when I see a piece of toast, somewhere there's a toaster. and I think there's great truth in that, you know, that people who have really seriously considered their spiritual path in life and have come to the conclusion that they're going to be an agnostic or an atheist or, you know, something in that spectrum. They're people who have truly independently investigated the truth they could find in life. And that means that they've gone beyond just rote acceptance and inheritance of their parents' belief systems, for example, or their society's belief systems. And anyone who does that has my admiration. I think it's a powerful thing to go on that spiritual search in life and to begin to ask these profound questions. So for me, I love talking to nuns. Some of my best friends are atheists.
I guess go ahead.
David, I'm just wondering, you mentioned, you know, that you're a peace optimist. And I'm thinking about the news that, you know, we want to stay current with what's going on. But it's so hard to remain a peace optimist if we're always looking at the news. And I know we're seeing one side, but it's hard to really remind ourselves that there's way more going on in the world than what we see on the news items. Do you have some advice about how to not get into that downward spiral while we're trying to stay current?
I do. Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. First, I would really advise that everyone carefully read, and even reread these two books, Factfulness and the Better Angels of Our Nature. I mentioned these in my talk. Factfulness is by a Swedish physician named Hans Rosling. And in that book, he surveys the condition of the world and compares what we think to the actual facts of the matters. And it's a funny and really insightful book about factfulness, about basing your judgments on facts, not emotions or things you've heard. This second book is a tome. It's, I don't know, 800 pages long, but it's by the Harvard thinker and public intellectual Steven Pinker. It's called The Better Angels of Our Nature: Why Violence Has Declined. And Steven Pinker makes a profound case for the historical decline of violence from now backward into human history. And I won't belabor all the points that he makes. I did a little bit of that in my talk, but I could speak about this book for 10 hours straight. It has altered my consciousness. I think if I had to place it on a pantheon of all the books I've read in my lifetime, it'd be right up there near the top. Why? Because he uses scientific fact to prove beyond the shadow of a doubt that violence in human society has declined and will continue to decline. So those
That
two
book-
books.
Can you say the name of that book again? I can't see it.
It's called The Better Angels of Our Nature,
Okay,
which of course is from Lincoln's,
yeah.
famous speech. The subtitle is Why Violence Has Declined. I see Lizanne took notes. So if you don't have it there at the library, she may be ordering it. Boy, what an incredible book that shows the arc of our history as regards violence. So those are two things. First, second thing, I have a friend who is really bothered by the news. He's a musician. He's a sensitive soul. He lives here in my community. Some of you may know him. His name's J.B. Eckel. He's won many Grammys and is a really talented singer and songwriter and guitar player. And JB told me a couple of months ago, he said, I'm going on a news fast. He said, I'm just turning it off. I'm only going to read, and I'm going to read selectively. And I said, are you worried that you'll miss, some important news? He said, no, you'll tell me. And I said, okay, it's a deal. I am an inveterate consumer of news. I read the New York Times and the Washington Post every morning, and I watch probably an hour's worth of PBS television news each evening. Why? Because Baha'u'llah said that we should all be intensely concerned with, what's going on in our time, in our society. And I am intensely concerned. But I've learned, because I was a journalist and still work as a journalist for so long, I've learned to filter out the noise. And much of journalism is noise. Unfortunately, it's really true. Our journalism is not as bad as it was during William Randolph Hearst's yellow journalism period, when journalists could actually start wars, but it is still corrupt, and it is corrupted by the lure of money. Sadly, as a working journalist in print, in radio and television, I learned that firsthand. The old saying, if it bleeds, it leads, is true of most local television news operations. They cover one crime at the top of their newscast, blaring, warnings to the public that they live in a crime-ridden society, and never, ever contrast that with the enormous positive news that occurs in every community every day. So you have to learn to, if you're going to consume news, you have to learn to consume it with a significant filter. In that regard, I've given talks on this, how to build that filter, what to put in it, et cetera. I won't belabor all that right now, but I will say that if you're going to watch news, select carefully the news outlet that you choose, and especially select it given the breadth of its coverage and the emphasis that it typically has. You can watch just about any newscast, you can listen on the radio, you can read a newspaper for about a week, and you can see the trend in that media outlet. You can certainly do it online as well. The trends are obvious. What do people cover? What do they select? And by the same token, what do they deselect? What do they not cover? I want to see coverage of major, positive, constructive events in the world. I also want to see coverage of the war in Ukraine. I want to know what's happening there. It's really incredibly important to our future as a human race for us to figure that out. but I want some balance between the two. And that's not easy to find, especially in television news. I would say watch the public channels. Carefully monitor any consumption you do of cable news. And disregard most network coverage. Why? Because the networks are basically headline services. I don't know if any of you remember when ABC, CBS, NBC, when they had hour-long newscasts every night. Remember Walter Cronkite? You know, Dan Rather, people like that who, you know, serious journalists who meant to really, truly bring information. Now, all those newscasts are half an hour and they're headline services. That's all they are. If they have a piece of particularly salacious or attention-grabbing video, they'll use that because they've realized that their main function at the networks is to sell commercial time. And it's really sad because our news has declined to such a great degree. The Baha'i writings say that that generally has to do with profit. That if news organizations are in it purely for profit, then you have to begin questioning their coverage. I hope that's helpful.
I was listening to the CBC first thing this morning, which I usually do, and they had a short interview on this very topic. And they interviewed a person who had retired from journalism. And his topic was, you know, all the bad news, everything is bang, 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 bad, you know, and that if you really did the research and went back, I think he was using Toronto, murders in Toronto as an example. And you did the research and went back, you'd find there really weren't any more murders now than there were 40 years ago.
Correct.
But,
Yep.
and I find that hard to believe when you hear the news and all that's happening, but he said this is true. But that's all that's brought up on the news is these situations over and over again. And so after listening to this interview, I've decided to forget the news. I'll listen to the CBC a little bit. I'll maybe watch 15 minutes of news in the morning just to make sure that we're not supposed to be evacuating for a forest fire here
Right.
or something like that. But, you know, I don't really need to watch all that stuff. It's just repetitive and really a downer, most of it.
You're
'Cause there's a
absolutely
lot
right.
of-
It's
a
meant,
lot of- Yeah,
it's meant to raise your blood pressure.
yeah, really.
Yeah, and that's really what this book Factfulness does. It analyzes what we think we know from our news consumption, and then in quiz form asks questions about those facts. And it's so fascinating because this author put together a big questionnaire on the basic trends in the world. And he's given it to many, many people, including world leaders and Nobel Prize winners and et cetera. And he says almost invariably people are wrong about the actual facts of human progress. Why? Because we're fed this steady diet of negative and blood pressure raising news that really is not news. It's only there to drive ratings and to sell ads. The internet has really weaponized this whole phenomenon because internet companies recognize that the more they can raise your blood pressure, the more they can increase your ire, the more they can offend you and make you angry, the more you're going to click. And guess what? That keeps you on those platforms and sells the advertising on those platforms. It's really unconscionable. It's irresponsible. Many governments are beginning to think about ways to try to alleviate the issue and help regulate it at the very least. Factfulness is, I think, one of the most insightful books I've read on that, in that regard, and it will help you, if you read it, it will help you construct that news filter that I'm recommending.
David, do you think the public broadcasters sometimes don't get enough funding to do their job properly?
Yes, definitely.
I think it's interesting that it seems like it's not only raising people's blood pressure, but that seems to be the source of a lot of divisiveness in society. But the peace gathering, it seems like when you gather people together, and then there were quite diverse people this year at that peace gathering, and just that coming together seemed to create something else. It created a whole different environment, and we're feeling the repercussions of that in Grand Forks. The art project, for example, that Collect project is being just in several businesses downtown, and you go on social media and see that how much people loving that, and the response. One particular response was, you could tell we're all one. So I
Yeah,
think
that's wonderful.
you have to bring people together, and not necessarily just like-minded people, diverse people who then come together and do those points of unity.
Thank you, Shelley. Yeah, that's really important.
Would you want any? No, you're okay. Yeah.
May I ask a question?
Oh, please do.
Well, John, I am of your generation, and I was an American. I came to Canada at the height of the Vietnamese War with my draft resisting husband. And if I could have been a draft resistor, I would have. I didn't count because I was a girl. But at that time, it was really it was a very intense time, as any of us who lived through it would know. It drastically changed my life. And it was in a ghost town in British Columbia, Canada, that I found the faith. So everything works out in the end. But my question is this, sorry for the rambling. At that time, we really were quite frightened of what was going on in the States and didn't want to have any part of it. Now, it's a very bad situation again. And I thought, oh my goodness, I thought my youth was terrible. What must it be like now? I mean, I have the protection of the faith now, but just, I don't even know what the question was. You lived through that period too. So what do you think about the difference between then and now?
Well, I think every generation has its own cross to bear. This one certainly, this new younger generation now has a great deal to grapple with, just like we did. only different. We grew up in a very different time. I can remember I grew up in Moses Lake, Washington, not too far from Grand Forks. And I can remember after breakfast, you know, during the summer on the weekend when I wasn't in school, my mother would say, "See you at dinner time." And I'd get out on my bike and explore and do things that no kid could do today. I see children and grandchildren now helicoptering over their kids and you know, controlling every aspect of and every moment of their lives. And I feel terrible for those children who don't have the ability to just be with themselves and learn who they are in silence and in contemplation, the way that so many of us did. So each generation has its hurdles. The hurdles in this generation are quite large. Social media has become kind of the defining one for this generation, but I think there are also many others. The solution to those, as Shelley mentioned earlier, is unity. We have to find ways to unify our divergent societies and heal the great divisions that have grown between us. I am thankful for and praise everyone and anyone who is engaged in that kind of work on any level. So we've been here about an hour. I wanted to walk you through at the end of our time together this evening. I wanted to walk you through a couple of things that I meant to say there at the peace gathering, but was too long-winded to include. They are 9 specific suggestions for peace building. And I hope these resonate with some of you. The first thing that I generally tell people who ask how to build peace is don't enlist in the military and do everything you can to prevent others from enlisting in the military. It's very difficult in the United States, not so much true in Canada, especially for poor sons and daughters who grow up without a way to fund their college education or even their high school education. And so they are targets for military enlistment. And I've tried to do a lot of work to get those kids some options. Interestingly enough, the Washington Post has reported that by a wide margin, recruitment in the world's militaries is dropping dramatically. It really helps for all of us to support a strong peacetime economy and a just and equitable distribution of wealth in that same regard. I think the second thing for me that is a great peace building step is to do everything we can in all of our actions to promote gender equality. Have you noticed the countries in the world where men and women are equal tend to be more productive, more civilized by a lot of different measures, and less aggressive. Gee, big surprise. We need more women leaders, scientists, scholars, artists, etc. And this really, the Baha'i teachings say that this is not a women's issue, it's a men's issue. Abdu'l-Baha said, when men own the equality of women, there will be no need for them to struggle for their rights. So guys, this is our issue, to do everything we can to promote gender equality. I really always encourage people with this one, number 3, to vote consciously and speak out about how you voted. I think it's really important to choose candidates for their peacefulness quotient above all other considerations, party, labels, etc. You've got to ask yourself before you get in the voting booth, is this person that I'm voting for a peaceful person? Or do they favor militarization and aggressiveness? In other words, vote for peace. Number 4, raise your children peacefully. Your grandchildren, the neighbor children, any children. Teach them empathy and kindness through your actions and not just your words. Never strike a child. Have a consistent moral code that your children and grandchildren can learn from, and learn from your actions, not just what you say. Number 5, read aggressively. I'm sure Liz Ann will support that one. Librarians are so wonderful. My heroes are librarians. Take classes. A friend of mine just started a peaceful book group. They're committed to reading only books about peace, and they're gathering every month, which I just love that idea. I love this quote. A writer I've been reading recently named Abraham Verghese. He wrote Cutting for Stone and has a new novel out. He's got a great quote that he told the New York Times in an interview recently. He said, "I like to remind my nonfiction reading friends that it was Uncle Tom's Cabin, not a politician or political scientists, that made slavery distasteful to most Americans." I like to tell people, if you want facts, read nonfiction. If you want truth, read fiction. And that includes novels about war. Catch-22, All Quiet on the Western Front, my friend Tim O'Brien's book, The Things They Carried, all of them are powerful reminders of why we must have peace. Number 6, and this may be the most important one, find a group of peaceful people that are working for the good of humanity and join them. It doesn't really matter in the final analysis what that group is. It just matters that you're working together as a group. God loves those who work in groups. Every city and town has charities, educational institutions, advocacy groups, spiritual organizations that are working for peace. And if you're part of that group, then you are a peace activist. You don't have to formally join. All you have to do is go to a meeting and say, how can I help? All those groups need you. This is a non-intuitive one, but lower your dependence on fossil fuels. That is really important, actually. We have already fought the first installments of the oil wars. Iraq 1 and 2, Afghanistan, now Ukraine, which is largely about energy. any small step you can take to minimize your dependence on fossil fuels will help avert future wars. Number 8, be a world citizen. Don't think of yourself so much as the citizen of your nation. Think of yourself as a citizen of the world, because that's truly what we are. Get a passport and use it. You know, go to other places. Encounter new people. Find a way to support others in those places, and it will enrich your life and it will make peace achievable. And finally, if you haven't already, work hard to develop a peaceful, nonviolent inner outlook in your own soul. Meditate every day. Really maintain a peacefulness practice of bringing yourself to account, of asking yourself, why did that make me angry? Why did I get upset when that happened? Why does that particular person push my buttons? You know, what is it in me that I can change to make myself a more peaceful human being? When you make that individual commitment to the fundamental unity and fellowship of all the peoples of the earth, you really begin to change. And ultimately, that means, I think, finding a role model, finding someone whose life choices you admire and aspire to, and modeling your life on that person's actions. For Baha'is, it's Abdul Baha, who dedicated his entire life to peace. For many, it's Christ or Gandhi or Martin Luther King. We have plenty of examples of these wonderful human beings who rose to the top of Maslow's pyramid of needs and began to recognize their responsibility to serve all humanity. Find that role model and just try to do what they did. Real simple. Study the life of that person and make your life congruent with what that person did. That's a tall order. It's not easy, but all of us can do it. Every one of us has the impetus inside us and the ability to do those things. Peace is inevitable. It will come. It is coming. We are making progress as a world toward it. And if all of us put into practice these steps on a real daily basis, we will have it. It may not happen in our generation. It may not happen in our children's generation. You know, an oak tree takes a long time to grow from a seed, but once it grows, it's strong. And that's what we're all doing. We're watering that seed now. We're looking toward the future, not the present. And we're building something that will last eternally. Once the world achieves the peace that we're talking about, it'll be almost impossible to go back. As Abdul Baha said, you know, we've tried war for 6,000 years. Now let's try peace for a while and see how that works for us. It is the bringer of all bounties, while war is the bringer of all tragedies. So all of us have a choice to make. Let's make it. It's really not that hard. And it's additionally, it's incredibly joyful. You know, it'll make you smile every day. It'll give you a feeling in your gut that can't be reproduced any other way, that you're truly serving the future of the human race. Thank you.
Thank you.
so much.
It's my great
Um,
pleasure. Thanks for inviting me. I hope to see all of you sometime soon.
That was such a wonderful way to end this evening, hearing the words of Abdul Baha. Let's try peace. We've tried war for so long. Let's try peace. So thank you so much for giving us so generously of your time and for giving us another chance to be together and listen to each other and work for peace together. Thanks, David.
Thank you all.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.